That question hung in the void long before the catastrophe began, whispered in training halls and mess decks by junior ratings too scared to sleep after hearing the shrieks in the far corridors, the ones the officers pretended not to notice. But no one aboard the Glory of Adrastus ever expected they would live the answer. The ship was a Titan-class cruiser, proud, resolute, a spear of humanity's will plunged into the ocean of stars. Its crew counted in the tens of thousands, each one drilled, hardened, fortified by discipline and devotion. These were soldiers of the Imperium. They did not fear the warp. At least, not aloud. But the warp had been listening. The journey should have been routine, an 8-day translation through a stable corridor to resupply a besieged outpost. The navigator had traced the route 100 times before. The astropaths sang of clear psychic tides. The priests declared favorable omens. Even the hull seemed to hum with confidence, as though the ancient machine spirit itself welcomed the voyage. Yet, on the second day, something shifted. It began subtly. The hum of the engines deepened into an unfamiliar vibration, as though the ship were straining against a hidden current. The sanctioned psychers felt it first, an ache behind the eyes, a pressure like unseen fingers gripping their skulls. They reported nothing, of course. Psychers rarely reported the first signs, they hoped the sensations would pass. They almost never did. By the third day, every crewman felt it to some degree. A weight in the air. A sense of being watched. A prickling on the skin whenever they passed through the deeper sections of the ship. The chapel candles sputtered without draft. Bulkheads shuddered in empty corridors. The Gellar Field emitters hummed at a pitch no human ear was ever meant to endure. No alarms rang. No orders were given. But a silent fear began to bloom in the hearts of the ship's company. Something unseen was circling them, testing them, waiting. On the command bridge, Captain Lyra Vorstag maintained her rigid composure. She was a woman forged by a lifetime of war, calm, precise, utterly unswayed by superstition. But even she found herself pausing between orders, listening to the unnerving lull between engine beats. She had commanded ships through warp storms countless times. She had seen a vessel torn in half by a Gellar collapse, its crew screaming as the Immaterium swallowed them. She knew the signs of warp instability as well as she knew her own name. This was different. The navigator, Sariok Vandal, suffered more than anyone. His third eye flickered behind its hooded veil, twitching to sights the uninitiated were never meant to imagine. His visions turned murky, twisting, unstable. What had once been a clear route now pulsed with violent distortions, threads of impossible color writhing like serpents through his mind. He saw reflections of the ship where no reflections should exist, copies, shadows, echoes, moving a fraction of a second behind them, as though some other glory of Adrastus trailed them through a fractured mirror of reality. He begged the captain for a delay in translation, a recalibration, anything to ease the strain. She granted a brief hold, but it did nothing. The presence coiling around them only drew tighter. By the fourth day, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the thrum of the engines. Some thought they were coolant lines reverberating, others blamed fatigue. But the whispers grew more insistent, shaping themselves into almost words, almost voices. Not quite human, not quite anything else. Crewmen began speaking to chaplains more frequently. Some feared they were hearing the voices of lost loved ones. Others believed the ship was trying to speak to them. A few swore they were being called by name from the shadows. When 2 ratings disappeared during routine maintenance rounds, no one wanted to believe the truth. They were listed as missing. Perhaps they had slipped on a gantry. Perhaps they had been careless. Perhaps they were still somewhere on the upper decks, injured but alive. But the search teams found only their tools, lying neatly in the center of an empty corridor. As though placed there, as though returned, and the whispers grew louder. Captain Vorstag convened her senior officers. The ship must be brought under control, she insisted. Whatever anomaly had taken root, they would purge it through discipline, prayer, and force of will. Troop rotations were tightened, patrols increased, and the psychers were ordered to meditate in shifts to project stability through the vessel's psychic layers. But order alone could not shield them from what came next. On the 5th day, the Gellar Field flickered. Just for a heartbeat, a single pulse of dimming light. But in that instant, the entire ship felt the fabric of reality groan. Every light dimmed, every crewman froze, every soul trembled. The psychers screamed, the navigators bled from their sealed sockets. And deep in the warp, something laughed. When the Gellar Field restabilized, its furnace-bright aura returned, but its rhythm was wrong. It pulsed too quickly, too sharply, like a heartbeat forced into panic. The priests recited litanies faster, stumbling over the words. The engineering decks erupted into frantic motion. The ship's company moved with the crisp precision of terror. But the warp is patient. It is eternal, and the glory of Adrastus was already drifting too far. On the 6th day, the navigator's station went dark. Seriok Vandal collapsed in the middle of a translation adjustment. His convulsions shook the entire dais. The veins in his face pulsed with warp burn. He spoke in a dozen voices not his own, some pleading, some condemning, some laughing in twisted harmony. He warned them that the path was gone, that the tides had shifted, that something vast, ancient, and ravenous had wrapped itself around the ship and was drawing it deeper, not along their route, but into a place that had no name, only hunger. The bridge crew stared at him in cold horror as he choked out his final words before slipping unconscious. We are no longer traveling through the warp. The warp is traveling through us. The silence that followed was worse than the screams. On the 7th day, the Gellar Field flickered again. And this time, it did not come back evenly. The lights dimmed, then surged. The air grew heavier, as though saturated with invisible pressure. The ship groaned like a living thing, metal contracting and expanding in unnatural rhythms. Shadows lengthened along the walls, far longer than they should, stretching into angles that defied geometry. Crewmen reported seeing silhouettes move where no silhouettes belonged. Shapes that resembled their fellow officers, but not quite. Forms that walked the halls a moment after the real ones passed. Echoes, doubles, reflections cast from no light source at all. The ship was no longer a vessel. It was becoming a labyrinth. A reflection, a trap. The warp does not merely distort reality. It digests it. And as the glory of Adrastus drifted deeper into its currents, the line between the crew's thoughts and the warp's hunger grew thin. Dreams bled into waking hours. Memories twisted into nightmares. Time stuttered and repeated in fragments, like a broken reel slipping through a projector. And always, the presence followed them. Close, patient, watching. As the 8th day dawned, the real horror began. Not with screams, not with alarms, but with a voice, clear, calm, human, echoing through every deck at once. Transmitted through the ship's Vox system in perfect clarity. This is Captain Lyra Vorstag. All hands, prepare for boarding. Every soul on the ship heard it. Every soul froze. Because Captain Vorstag was standing on the bridge, her lips pressed tightly together, having spoken not a single word. And yet her voice continued through the Vox, carrying that same steady tone, that same controlled cadence. They have arrived. The bridge crew turned to her, wide-eyed, pale, trembling. But before any of them could speak, before they could process what was happening, the hull of the glory of Adrastus shuddered with a force beyond physics, beyond reason, beyond the boundary between worlds. It was the feeling of something large enough to envelop a battleship. Something impossibly old. Something impossibly close. Something knocking. Because that was the question whispering through every heart aboard the glory of Adrastus the moment the hull shuddered. Every deck froze. Every officer hesitated. Even the machine spirits paused, their humming stuttering like startled breaths. And if you stay with this story until the very end, you'll discover the truth behind that knock. Something even the Imperium tries to bury. Something whispered only by those who have come back, changed. For a heartbeat, the ship hung in oppressive silence. No alarms, no orders, Just the slow, groaning exhale of metal strained by forces it was never designed to withstand. The crew waited, for orders, for clarity, for a miracle, but none came. Captain Vorstag tried to steady her voice as she demanded a damage report, but the Vox channels were flooded with static so dense it felt alive, pressing against the ears, pulsing like a heartbeat. Then the knocking came again. Not a boom, not an explosion, a knock, measured, deliberate, as though knuckles the size of engines rapped gently on the hull, testing its firmness, feeling the thin walls that separated reality from the hungry expanse outside. Even the air inside the ship seemed to vibrate with each impact, a tremor that crept down the spine and settled like ice in the stomach. The psychers felt it most. They clutched their heads, writhing as invisible claws scraped against the edges of their minds. Their screams didn't sound human anymore, not entirely. Some begged to be sealed away. Others clawed at the bulkheads as if trying to escape through solid metal. A few simply stared into the distance, silent, lips moving without sound as though answering questions no one else could hear. On the command bridge, Captain Vorstag locked her stance, refusing to let fear dictate her posture. She knew that terror spreads through a ship faster than fire, and once panic takes hold, no chain of command can pull it back. She ordered the Gellar Field to maximum reinforcement. The Mechanicus priests chanted in a frenzy, voices shaking as they invoked the rites of stability, but even their prayers could not mask the truth. The field shimmered unevenly, pulsing like a dying heart. Then the navigator regained consciousness. Seriok Vandal gasped as if surfacing from drowning, his third eye snapping open beneath his hooded veil. What he saw made him lurch backward, pressing himself against the bulkhead as though trying to merge with the metal. His voice shook with pure, unfiltered terror as he declared, "Something is inside the corridor of our path. Not a creature, not a demon. A place that is alive." Before anyone could question him, the lights dimmed. Not all at once, no, that would have been merciful. Instead, they faded in a rippling wave from the deepest decks upward, as though something were moving through the ship, sliding beneath the surface of reality, brushing against the power conduits, devouring illumination as it came. In those seconds of dying light, the crew saw shapes moving in the glow. Not silhouettes, not shadows, reflections, multiple copies of themselves, lagging a half-second behind, mimicking their movements with an uncanny stiffness, as though learning how a human body should behave. Some reflections did not mimic at all. They stared back, unmoving, eyes too wide, smiles too still. The lights flared back to full brightness, and the reflections vanished. But the knocking did not. It grew louder, closer, more insistent. Deck security teams raced toward the hull impact points, but when they reached the outer corridors, something was waiting for them. Not an intruder, not a rupture, but impossible geometry. The hallways had changed. Doors stood where doors had never been. Bulkheads twisted into configurations that violated the blueprints of the ship. Corridors looped into impossible angles, leading back to their own beginnings. One squad reported walking down a single passageway for 10 minutes, only to find themselves emerging behind their own shadows. Another squad reported something worse. Silent figures standing at the far end of a newly formed corridor. Humanoid, but wrong, limbs too long, heads tilted at painful angles, skin stretched thin like wax over wire. They didn't move, they didn't breathe, but every time the squad blinked, the figures were closer. Silent, waiting, watching. The squad retreated. Two didn't make it back. By the time the first screams echoed through the engineering decks, the crew understood the truth they had been trying to deny. They weren't dealing with a boarding action. They weren't dealing with demons. They weren't even dealing with creatures. They were dealing with a place, a region of the warp so alien that space did not merely twist, it thought. It reshaped the ship. It mimicked the crew. It learned. And it wanted something. What that something was, you'll understand before this story ends. There are moments in the warp when a ship stops feeling like metal and machinery and begins to feel like a memory. One that isn't yours, one that resents your presence, one that wants you to leave, or vanish. That was the sensation that gripped the glory of Adrastus as the impossible corridors folded inward, reshaping themselves with quiet, surgical precision. It was no longer just a place where things lurked. It was something that paid attention. The first clear sign of this came from the Vox channels. Voices, crew voices, began echoing through the system long after their owners had stopped speaking. A medic's request for emergency supplies played on loop for nearly 10 minutes before cutting off mid-syllable. A deck officer's frantic warning repeated with distorted pitch, the words stretching, twisting, deepening into something almost melodic, as though the warp were practicing human speech. Then there was the voice that belonged to no one. Calm, meticulous, curious. It spoke the names of crew members who had gone missing. Only their names, spoken slowly, as if savoring the sound. By the time the command bridge realized the Vox wasn't malfunctioning, entire sections of the ship had fallen eerily silent. Patrol teams reported that some corridors were coated in a thin, shimmering residue that clung to armor like frost, except it wasn't cold. It felt warm, pulsing faintly, like skin. When scraped away, it grew back in moments, as though regenerating. The Mechanicus priests refused to touch it. Meanwhile, the shadows grew bolder. At first, they clung to the corners, stretching too far, too thin, following the humans with hungry patience. But soon they began peeling off walls entirely, detaching like oil slicks lifting from the surface of water. They moved without sound, without hesitation, drifting just out of reach as if scouting, analyzing, learning the limits of their prey. In the lower decks, entire sections became wrong. Dozens of crew members became trapped in looping hallways, walking 5, 10, 20 minutes only to open a door and step into the same corridor from a different angle. Some walked until their boots bled. Others tried carving marks into the walls, only to watch the metal knit itself back together as soon as they blinked. But the worst reports came from the central barracks. A group of voidsmen awoke to find someone else, something else, sleeping in their bunks. Their own bodies, or perfect replicas of them, curled beneath the sheets as if resting. The figures dissipated the moment they were touched, dissolving into a haze of color that melted into the floor like spilled paint. Moments later, the lights flickered, and every bed was empty again. Not long afterward, an ensign sprinted to the bridge in pure hysteria. She claimed she'd found the helm officer standing alone in a maintenance room, except the helm officer had been on the bridge at the time. She said the copy turned its head too slowly, smiled too widely, and whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Captain Vorstag ordered emergency containment protocols. She locked down the lower decks. She tripled the Gellar Field rota. She demanded immediate analysis from the navigator. But Seriok Vandal was shaking uncontrollably now, his third eye sealed shut, as though refusing to witness what surrounded the ship. His voice cracked with strain as he explained that they were no longer adrift, they had been caught. Not by an entity, not by a creature, by a region of the warp so dense that it behaved like a mind. A labyrinth with intention, a landscape with curiosity, a place that was studying them, a place that was using the ship as a canvas. He called it a cognitive zone, a term recorded only in the most forbidden segments of ancient navigator archives. Places where warp storms were not storms at all but thinking formations, psychic reefs that shaped themselves around consciousness like mirrors made of nightmares. The glory of Adrastus hadn't been pulled in by accident. It had been chosen. Even as he spoke, the lights dimmed again, and the knocking returned. But this time, it wasn't on the hull. It came from inside the ship. Slow, methodical, moving, knock, 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 traveling down the corridor toward the bridge. Whatever was learning, whatever was mimicking, whatever was forming itself out of reflected reality. It was getting closer. The knocking approached with an impossible precision, echoing through the metal skeleton of the ship like a ritual drumbeat. Every crew member felt it, not just in their ears, but in their bones, as though the vibrations were tunneling directly into their marrow. The bridge fell silent. No one dared to move. No one dared to breathe. It wasn't the sound of something trying to break in. It was the sound of something taking its time. The corridor outside the bridge door grew unnaturally quiet. No hum of power conduits. No distant clatter of boots. No ambient thrum of the ship's machinery. Just silence, suffocating, heavy, absolute. Captain Vorstag signaled her armsmen to stand ready, but even they hesitated. Training could prepare a soldier for war, for enemies, for horrors. But nothing in their lives had prepared them for a knock that came from nowhere familiar. Then it stopped. The entire ship held its breath. A moment later, the bridge door chimed. Someone outside had activated the entry panel. Someone was requesting to come in. Captain Vorstag's voice was a whisper of steel as she demanded identification. For a moment, there was no answer, just crackling interference. Then a voice came through, distorted at first, then sharpening with painful clarity. It was her voice. Captain Lyra Vorstag's voice. Open the door. Every officer on the bridge stared at her in horrified disbelief. She hadn't touched her vox bead. She hadn't uttered a sound. But her own voice echoed from the other side of the bulkhead with perfect cadence, perfect confidence, perfect authority, as though it had rehearsed her every word. The armsmen fanned out, leveling their weapons at the sealed door, hands trembling. Captain Vorstag didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. The voice came again. Same tone, same pitch, same command. Open the door. This time, the voice laughed afterward. A soft, thoughtful laugh. As if trying the sound for the first time. Captain Vorstag's second-in-command, Lieutenant Karos, stepped forward and disabled the proximity unlock. The door was now sealed manually, locked behind hardened overrides. Whatever was outside would not enter. But something else happened. The shadows beneath the door shifted. Not cast by any light. Not tied to any form. They stretched in wrong directions, bending as though cast by a sun no human eye could ever imagine. Then they pulled back, sliding away like liquid darkness evaporating under an unseen heat. A minute passed. 2. The knocking did not return. But the dread remained. From the lower decks came a sudden burst of panicked vox traffic. Shouts, screams, garbled cries for help. The words collided over one another, forming a chaotic storm of terror. The fragments that broke through were chilling. It looks like Sergeant Hale. But he's standing inside the wall. Eyes black, no, empty. Don't let it touch you. The transmission ended in a gut-wrenching shriek. Captain Vorstag knew she had to act. She deployed containment teams to the lower decks with strict instructions. No one moves alone, and anything that resembles a crewman must be treated as hostile. But the deeper the teams pushed, the stranger the ship became. Bulkheads pulsed faintly as if the ship were breathing. Sigils of unknown meaning rippled through the metal, appearing and fading like afterimages burned into the eyes. Then they found it. The first complete mimic. It stood motionless at the center of a cargo bay, an exact replica of a deck officer who'd gone missing earlier that shift. But this one was incomplete. The face was stretched into an expression that looked carved rather than grown. The fingers were too long, tapering to translucent points. And the eyes were empty hollows, black pits swallowing all light. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. But it turned its head as the squad entered. Not by rotating its neck, but by twisting its entire torso, bones cracking in a fluid, grotesque spiral, aligning its face with theirs in a single unnatural motion. The squad opened fire. The mimic didn't fall. It simply dissolved, collapsing into a puddle of color, swirling like oil as it drained into the floor and vanished. Moments later, the lights flickered. And every member of the squad heard their own voice, whisper from behind them. You wasted that one. Panic erupted. Two voidsmen vanished into thin air as they turned corners that weren't there a moment before. One screamed until the walls swallowed him whole. The remaining members retreated, firing blindly into shadows that slithered along the ceiling. When the survivors reached the corridor junction, they discovered something worse than the mimic. They discovered themselves, standing side by side in the intersection. Perfect replicas, smiling, no weapons raised, just smiling. The real squad backed away in horror. The copies took a single synchronized step forward, lips stretching wider than human anatomy ever intended. The corridor lights dimmed to a crimson pulse, and the air filled with a sound halfway between static and whispering, like the ship itself was exhaling in anticipation. Then the copies opened their mouths. And their screams were exactly the screams of the missing crew, exact pitch, exact breath, exact terror. Captain Vorstag heard it all from the bridge. She made a decision she hoped she would never have to make. A shipwide purge order. Not of the corridors, not of the warp signatures. A purge of the crew itself. Anyone who had been alone. Anyone who had become separated. Anyone who acted strangely. Anyone who hesitated. Because in the heart of the warp, surrounded by a place that mimicked thought and flesh, no one could be trusted, not even those who claimed to be human. Especially not those. And as the purge began, the ship groaned with satisfaction, as though this was exactly what it wanted. The order spread through the ship with the cold efficiency of a guillotine blade. It moved not as a whisper, but as a command etched into the spine of every loyal crew member. Trust no one, verify nothing, and destroy anything that might not be human. In any other circumstance, such an order would have shattered morale. But in the warp, where identity could be worn like a mask, it felt less like cruelty and more like inevitability. At first, the crew obeyed with grim determination. Squads patrolled in tightly locked formations, checking each other's vitals, reciting shared memories, whispering litanies to anchor their minds. But even these measures faltered. Some crew failed the memory tests. Others avoided eye contact. A few laughed at the wrong moment, a sound too sharp, too rehearsed, as though they were still learning what humor was supposed to feel like. Those individuals disappeared, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. By the 5th hour of the purge, the decks ran with the echoes of confusion, shouted challenges, desperate pleas, sudden bursts of gunfire. Doors sealed and unsealed without command input. Lights dimmed whenever someone tried to confirm another's identity. The ship seemed to savor the suspicion, feeding it, thickening it like fog. But the worst part was the silence that followed each execution. Whenever a suspected mimic was purged, the ship itself responded. Not physically, not visibly, but audibly. A distant, resonant vibration would ripple through the hull, soft, but unmistakable, like a sigh of deep, contented satisfaction. Captain Vorstag heard it more than anyone. She stood at the center of the bridge, one hand gripping the railing so tightly her gauntlet creaked. Her officers glanced at her with haunted eyes. Every one of them wondered the same question but dared not ask. What if the ship wanted the purge? What if the ship needed it? What if the ship was choosing who survived? The navigator, pale and trembling, finally spoke the truth none of them wanted to confront. He explained that the cognitive zone, the thinking region of the warp that had ensnared them, did not merely distort reality. It absorbed it, integrated it, translated it into its own form of identity. The more the crew killed each other, the more fear they produced, the more the zone understood humanity. It wasn't hunting them, it was studying them, piece by piece, emotion by emotion, death by death. The purge accelerated the learning process. And the warp was grateful. Meanwhile, the surviving crews faced horrors far beyond mimics. In some sections, the walls began to observe. Hundreds of tiny, eye-like fissures opened across the surfaces, dark pits surrounded by ripples of warped metal, blinking slowly as they tracked human movement. Some crew reported hearing faint breathing emanating from the bulkheads, as though massive lungs exhaled behind the steel. In the hydroponics deck, plants withered into dust within seconds of being touched, as if the zone rejected biological life that didn't belong to its experiment. The water reservoirs boiled without heat. The air recyclers exhaled cold vapor that condensed into shapes resembling human faces before evaporating. The mimics themselves grew more sophisticated. They no longer waited in the shadows. They no longer appeared incomplete. They no longer hesitated. One squad encountered a perfect replica of their commanding officer, down to the scar above his left brow and the faint tremor in his right hand. He spoke with perfect inflection. He issued orders the real officer might have given. He even recited prayers he had whispered since childhood, ones no outsider could know. The squad believed him, until one soldier noticed that the copy didn't blink. They executed him instantly. The corpse dissolved into shimmering dust. A moment later, the real commanding officer arrived, alone. The squad hesitated, weapons raised. The officer looked at them with exhausted eyes and whispered, "I understand." Half the squad fired, half didn't. What followed was a massacre of confusion, friend against friend, reality against reflection, until nothing remained in that corridor but echoes and a single pair of bloody footprints leading nowhere. Captain Vorstag knew then that the purge was not a solution. It was a spiral, a descent, a trap set by something unimaginably patient. And then the ship proved it. At exactly 0400 ship time, every door on the lower decks sealed simultaneously. Emergency overrides failed. Servo locks fused shut. Access codes scrambled themselves into symbols that hurt to look at. Entire sections of the crew were trapped behind steel, pounding on the doors, shouting for help. For a moment, Vorstag believed they might still be human. Then the pounding synchronized, not frantic, not panicked, rhythmic, precise, a single unified knock, echoing the same pattern heard earlier on the hull. The ship was telling her something familiar. They are not yours anymore. In the quiet that followed, the Gellar Field flickered again. This time, it did not falter. This time, it shifted. The aura changed from golden to a deep, dark crimson. The priests panicked, reciting counter hymns, but their voices wavered. The machine's spirit wailed through the conduits, a keening metallic scream. And for the first time since the voyage began, the navigator collapsed to his knees in pure horror. The Gellar Field was no longer keeping warp entities out. It was keeping something else in. Something the cognitive zone wasn't finished shaping. Something the ship was still building. Or worse, something it had already built. And now, it wanted to show the crew their new creation. As the Sanctum Vindicta tears free from the warp, reality returns like a punch to the lungs, hard, violent, and so sudden the survivors don't even believe it's real at first. The stars are fixed. The void is silent. Sensors function. Vox channels reconnect. The constant low-grade whisper of the warp, the pressure behind the eyes, the sensation of being watched, gone. Or at least, muted. For the first time in what feels like centuries, there is peace. But peace is never the end of a warp story. The ship limps into a nearby Imperial system, its once proud hull scarred black and purple by energies no mortal forge can replicate. Astropaths collapse in tears upon sensing its approach, overwhelmed by the psychic residue radiating from its frame. Docking crews refuse to board. Mechanicus priests chant litanies, convinced the vessel is cursed. Word spreads quickly. A ship lost for generations has returned. The surviving crew, what's left of them, were taken into custody, screened, interrogated, tested for taint. Commissars stare into their eyes, looking for flickers of corruption. Medicae scan for mutation. Psychers probe their minds for warp residue. Some pass. Some don't. Some scream when asked simple questions. Some laugh when they shouldn't. Some just stare, as though part of them is still somewhere else. And maybe they are. Captain Helbrecht is deemed fit for duty, eventually. His report is long, detailed, and classified beyond most offices' clearance levels. But something in him has changed. He's quieter. He's harder. His gaze lingers a little too long on shadows. And when he sleeps, on the rare nights he actually can, he dreams of doors sealed in black metal, still vibrating, still whispering from the other side. Corsia, the sanctioned psyker, is transferred to a black ship without ceremony. She walks willingly, almost relieved to be contained. Before she departs, she leaves the captain a single message. The warp doesn't forget its guests. The Mechanicus investigate the object retrieved from the derelict, the impossible sphere of colorless metal that should never have existed. They lock it in stasis, bury it under prayer and steel, and declare it a xeno-heretical unknown anomaly. But inside the stasis field, something shifts. Something breathes. Something waits. As for the Sanctum Vindicta itself, the Inquisition debates whether to destroy it or study it. Neither option feels safe. Tech priests argue that no corruption is detected, yet every Auspec's pulse returns slight distortions, tiny irregularities in its signature, as though part of the ship is displaced, offset in time, or vibrating on a frequency not meant for the material world. The final decision is to seal it, to lock it away, to hide it where no one will touch it. But deep in the ship, far below the sealed decks, in a forgotten corridor where the lights flicker for reasons no tech adept can diagnose, the air occasionally ripples. Faintly, softly, like a curtain brushing against an open window. Sometimes the ripple forms a whisper. And sometimes that whisper calls a name. Because that's the truth about a warp ordeal. You never truly escape. You just stop noticing the chains.